Picture this moment. It's 1946, somewhere in rural Texas. A Japanese prisoner of war stands at the gates of the camp that's held him for the past 2 years. American officers have just informed him that he's free to return to Japan. The war is over. He can go home. But instead of joy, his face shows something else entirely: terror, confusion, and a paralyzing uncertainty that the Americans cannot comprehend. This scene repeated itself across dozens of POW camps throughout the United States, and what happened next would reveal one of the most profound cultural divides of the entire war. To understand why some of these men chose to stay rather than return home, we need to go back to their childhoods in 1920s and 1930s Japan. Imagine a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting in a classroom. His teacher tells him a story that will shape the rest of his life. It's about the 47 Ronin, masterless samurai who avenged their lord's death and then committed ritual suicide because honor demanded it. The boy learns that death with honor is beautiful, while life with shame is worse than any death. This isn't presented as mythology or philosophy. It's presented as the fundamental truth about what it means to be Japanese. Now multiply this lesson by thousands of similar ones. Every textbook, every school assembly, every youth group meeting reinforces the same message. Your life belongs to the emperor. Death in service is glorious, and surrender is unthinkable. By the time these boys reach military age, this isn't something they believe intellectually. It's woven into their sense of identity as deeply as their own names. When these young men enter military service, the indoctrination intensifies exponentially. The Senjin-kun, the military field code issued in 1941, makes it explicit. Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. But it's not just written in a code. It's beaten into them during training, sometimes literally. Soldiers who show weakness are punished brutally. Officers tell them stories of soldiers who chose death over capture and are now enshrined as heroes. They tell them stories of captured soldiers whose families killed themselves from shame. And here's the crucial detail that Americans never quite grasped. This wasn't just about the individual soldier. In Japanese culture of that era, shame wasn't individual, it was collective. If you surrendered, your parents would be disgraced. Your siblings would have trouble finding work or marriage partners. Your children would be marked for life. Your village would hold a funeral for you as if you had died, because, in every way that mattered socially, you had. Some families would literally strike your name from the family register. You would become a non-person. So when these soldiers went into combat, they truly believed that death was the only acceptable outcome besides victory. This explains the phenomena that so horrified American troops: the banzai charges, where Japanese soldiers would run directly into machine gun fire rather than retreat; the mass suicides, when defeat became inevitable. At Saipan in 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians jumped off cliffs rather than be captured. American troops watched in horror, trying to convince people not to jump. But they couldn't overcome years of indoctrination with a few shouted words. The Battle of Tarawa in 1943 illustrates this perfectly. Nearly 5,000 Japanese soldiers defended the island. When it was over, only 17 were captured alive, and most of those were unconscious when taken. The rest fought until they were killed or killed themselves. This wasn't fanaticism in the way Americans understood it. It was the logical outcome of a value system where death truly was preferable to the alternative. But here's where it gets complex. As the war progressed and Japan's situation became desperate, more soldiers did surrender. Not many at first, but the numbers grew. These men had reached points of such extreme desperation that the immediate instinct for survival overrode years of conditioning. Maybe they were wounded so badly they couldn't commit suicide. Maybe they were starving and delirious. Maybe they'd been separated from their units and were completely alone. Or maybe, just maybe, they'd started to question what they'd been taught. The moment of capture was often deeply traumatic. American soldiers reported that Japanese troops who surrendered would often refuse to look at them, as if the Americans didn't exist or they themselves didn't exist. Some would request execution, genuinely believing death would be preferable to what came next. Others would seem to enter a dissociative state, mechanically following orders but seemingly absent from their own bodies. They had crossed a line they'd been taught their entire lives was uncrossable, and the psychological impact was shattering. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of the torture and execution Japanese propaganda had promised, American troops generally treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. Now let's be clear, treatment wasn't always perfect, and some prisoners did suffer abuse. War brings out the worst in people, and there were certainly Americans who wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor, the Bataan Death March, and countless other atrocities. But official policy was humane treatment, and it was generally enforced. Imagine being that Japanese soldier. You've surrendered, expecting to be killed. Instead, an American medic treats your wounds. You're given food, real food, more food than you've seen in months, because Japan's supply lines have collapsed. You're given a blanket and a place to sleep. Nobody tortures you. Nobody executes you. This cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. Many prisoners were eventually transferred to POW camps in the United States, far from the fighting. Life in these camps was structured but relatively comfortable. Prisoners worked, usually in agriculture or non-combat military support roles. They played baseball, formed music groups, took English classes. Some camps had better food than American civilians were getting because of rationing. Here's where the Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, played a crucial role. Many served as interpreters and interrogators. Imagine being a Japanese prisoner and suddenly meeting someone who looks Japanese, speaks perfect Japanese, but is thoroughly American. These Nisei understood both cultures intimately. They could explain to prisoners that surrendering didn't have to mean dishonor, that they could still have meaningful lives, that American values offered a different framework for understanding honor and duty. Some Nisei would counsel prisoners on how to frame their surrender in letters home. You were unconscious when captured, they might suggest. You obeyed the emperor's surrender order. These weren't just lies. They were cultural translation, finding ways for prisoners to maintain some sense of honor within their own framework, while adapting to new circumstances. Inside the camps, complex social dynamics emerged. Some prisoners maintained rigid military discipline, refusing to cooperate with anything beyond what Geneva Convention required. Others began studying American democracy, reading about concepts like individual rights and popular sovereignty that contradicted everything they'd been taught. A few became what the hardliners called converts or traitors, men who openly embraced democratic ideals. This sometimes led to violence. In a few camps, militant prisoners attacked or even killed other prisoners they deemed too cooperative with Americans. These weren't simple conflicts. They were battles over identity and values playing out in miniature. Could a Japanese person embrace democracy without betraying their essential Japaneseness? The militants said no. Others weren't so sure. Then came August 1945, and the emperor's radio address announcing Japan's surrender. For many prisoners, This was the first time they'd heard the Emperor's voice. It was considered too sacred for ordinary broadcast. The recording was scratchy. The Emperor spoke in formal classical Japanese that many couldn't fully understand. But the message was clear. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. All Japanese military personnel were ordered to lay down their arms. This changed everything and nothing. The Emperor's order theoretically absolved soldiers of shame for surrendering. They were now following orders, the highest duty. But it didn't erase the years of conditioning or the reality of what awaited them at home. Japan, in 1945, was devastated. Cities had been firebombed into rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by weapons prisoners couldn't even comprehend. The country faced potential starvation. The Americans were occupying the home islands. Everything these men had fought for was gone. American authorities began preparing for repatriation in 1946. Ships would carry prisoners back to Japan, where they'd be released into a country under foreign occupation, a country that had lost everything. The Americans expected relief and joy from prisoners finally going home. Instead, they encountered an unexpected reaction. Many prisoners were terrified. Officers conducting interviews found prisoners expressing concerns the Americans couldn't initially understand. How can I face my family? What will my village say? Will I be able to find work? The Americans tried to reassure them. The war was over. Everyone would understand. Japan was moving forward. Democratic reforms meant things would be different. But they were operating from completely different cultural assumptions. Some prisoners asked if there was any way they could stay in the United States. Others asked about emigrating to third countries. A few outright refused repatriation. American authorities were baffled and, in some cases, somewhat pleased. Weren't these men essentially choosing American values over their former militarism? But the reality was far more complicated. The prisoners who wanted to stay had diverse and overlapping motivations. The most common was simply fear of shame. Even though the Emperor had surrendered, these men didn't trust that their individual surrenders would be forgiven. They imagined returning to families who would reject them, communities that would shun them, employers who wouldn't hire them. Some of this fear was rational, based on what they knew of pre-war Japanese society. Some was probably exaggerated by anxiety and trauma, but it was real to them. Others had genuinely come to appreciate aspects of American life. Not all of it. Many still felt deeply Japanese and found American culture crude or incomprehensible in many ways. But they'd experienced things they valued. Personal freedom, material abundance, the idea that common people could criticize their leaders, the concept that individual life had value independent of service to the state. A few had formed real friendships with Americans, guards who had treated them kindly, civilians in towns near the camps who had employed them, even romantic relationships, though these were officially discouraged. For some, there was literally nothing to return to. Their families had been killed in bombing raids. Their hometowns had been burned to the ground. They had no property, no prospects, no connections. Starting over in America, as difficult as that would be, seemed no harder than starting over in the ruins of Japan. A smaller number had undergone genuine political transformation. They had rejected the militarism and emperor worship of their youth and become believers in democracy and individual rights. These men sometimes felt they would be in danger in Japan, or that they couldn't contribute to Japan's reconstruction because of their POW status. Some thought they could better serve by learning more about democracy abroad first. The American response to these requests was mixed. Officially, agreements with Japan required repatriating POWs, but there was flexibility in practice. Some prisoners who adamantly refused repatriation were allowed to apply for asylum or immigration through normal channels. Though this process could take years and faced legal hurdles, since U.S. immigration law of that era severely restricted Asian immigration. Others were encouraged to return to Japan initially, with the understanding that they could emigrate later if they wished. Some took this option. Others went to third countries first, particularly Brazil, Peru, or Argentina, which had established Japanese immigrant communities. From there, some eventually made their way to the United States. The vast majority, of course, did return to Japan. The repatriation process stretched through 1946 and into 1947. Ships carried thousands of former prisoners back to Japanese ports, where they were processed by occupation authorities and released. And then they had to face what they'd been dreading: going home. The reality they found was complex and varied dramatically by individual circumstance. Post-war Japan was a society in profound shock and transformation. The entire social order had been upended. The emperor had declared he was human, not divine. The military had been disbanded. Women had been given the vote. Land reform was breaking up the old agricultural system. Democratic ideals were being taught in schools. In this context of total transformation, many communities simply didn't have the bandwidth to focus on the specific shame of individual POWs. Many returnees found that while stigma existed, it wasn't the absolute social death they'd feared. Families were often just relieved they were alive. In communities where many families had lost sons, a son who had survived was precious, even if he'd been captured. Some villages and towns had been so completely destroyed, and populations so scattered, that old social networks that would enforce traditional shame simply no longer existed in the same way. But experiences varied enormously. Some men did face rejection from families who couldn't overcome the shame. Some struggled to find employment because employers viewed former POWs as unreliable or cowardly. Some communities did maintain traditional attitudes, where being a former prisoner remained a serious mark against someone. Men who had surrendered early in the war before Japan's overall defeat faced harsher judgment than those who had laid down arms after the emperor's surrender order. The psychological burden on returnees was immense. They carried multiple traumas: combat experiences, the shame and shock of capture, the disorientation of life in American captivity, the guilt about what they'd done or failed to do in the war, and now the challenge of reintegrating into a society that no longer existed in the form they'd left. What we now recognize as PTSD was epidemic among these veterans, but mental health support barely existed. Japanese culture valued stoicism and discouraged discussing painful emotions. Many men simply suffered in silence. Some found purpose in Japan's reconstruction. The country's remarkable economic recovery in the 1950s and 1960s provided opportunities for men to rebuild their lives through work. Success in business or a profession could help restore honor in a society that was learning to value economic achievement over military glory. Some former POWs became teachers, helping educate a new generation in democratic values. Others went into business and contributed to Japan's export miracle, but others never recovered. Depression was common. Alcoholism rates were high among veterans. Some men essentially withdrew from society, unable to find a place in the new Japan. Family relationships often suffered. Men who had been transformed by their wartime experiences sometimes found they couldn't relate to family members who hadn't been through the same things. The generation gap between these men and their children could be especially painful. Those who stayed in or emigrated to America faced their own challenges. Immigration law made naturalization difficult. It wasn't until 1952 that Japanese immigrants became eligible for U.S. citizenship, and even then the process was restrictive. These men faced language barriers, economic discrimination, and the general anti-Japanese sentiment that lingered in post-war America. Many had to take jobs far below their education and skills levels. They also faced identity challenges that were profound and ongoing. They weren't Japanese American in the way that term was understood. They weren't descendants of pre-war immigrants. They hadn't experienced the wartime incarceration camps. They didn't grow up in Japanese American communities. They were former enemy soldiers living in the country they'd fought against. This made them objects of suspicion for some Americans and created distance from the Japanese American community as well. Yet some built successful lives. They found niches where their Japanese language and cultural knowledge were valuable. Import-export businesses, Japanese restaurants, translation services. Some married American women and raised families. Their children would be fully American in a way they themselves never quite could be. And this vicarious integration sometimes gave meaning to their choice to stay. The comparative context is illuminating. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs were also held in the United States during World War II, and many of them also chose to stay after the war or emigrated later. But their motivations were generally more straightforward. Economic opportunity, escaping post-war chaos in Europe, fleeing Soviet expansion. German and Italian soldiers didn't face the same existential shame for being captured. They could more easily imagine returning home and resuming normal lives. After the Korean War, something similar happened with Chinese and North Korean POWs, many of whom chose not to be repatriated. They faced political systems that branded surrender as treason and would likely have punished them severely. This parallel suggests that totalitarian ideologies that make surrender unthinkable create similar psychological traps for POWs, regardless of specific cultural context. The story of these Japanese POWs illuminates several profound truths about war, culture, and human psychology. First, it shows how completely military indoctrination can reshape human instincts. The survival instinct is supposed to be the strongest biological imperative, yet these men had been conditioned to view death as preferable to capture. That's a staggering achievement of social conditioning, and a deeply troubling one. Second, it reveals the power of shame as a social force. These men weren't afraid of physical punishment for surrendering. They were afraid of social death, of becoming non-persons in the eyes of their communities. That fear was strong enough to make some prefer literal death or exile to foreign lands over returning home. Shame, it turns out, can be more powerful than fear of violence. Third, it demonstrates both the power of cultural programming and its limits. The indoctrination these men received was intense and lifelong, yet some of them were able to question it, to adapt to new value systems, to choose different paths than their conditioning dictated. Human beings aren't infinitely malleable. Even the strongest cultural programming runs up against individual judgment, experience, and the desire for a meaningful life. Fourth, it shows the complex aftermath of total war. Modern warfare doesn't just kill and destroy. It creates entire populations of displaced people who no longer fit anywhere. It tears apart cultural fabrics and forces impossible choices. Japan's relatively successful post-war transformation meant that eventually most returnees could find a place in the new society, but the process was painful and incomplete. Not everyone could make that transition successfully. The descendants of these men whether they returned to Japan or stayed in America, have only recently begun exploring their fathers' and grandfathers' stories publicly. For decades, many families simply didn't discuss it. The men themselves often didn't want to talk about experiences that remained painful and complicated. Children and grandchildren knew their fathers or grandfathers had served in the war, but often knew few details about capture, imprisonment, or the difficult choices afterward. In recent years, as these descendants have researched family histories, visited former campsites, and accessed archives, they've pieced together stories that illuminate both specific family experiences and broader historical patterns. This work has been part of healing intergenerational trauma, helping younger generations understand the weight their elders carried and why they may have been distant, silent, or troubled. In historical memory, these stories remain relatively obscure. In Japan, World War II, experiences are still sensitive subjects, and POWs represent a particularly uncomfortable topic that doesn't fit easily into either victimization or aggression narratives about the war. In the United States, the Pacific War often receives less attention than the European theater, and when POWs are discussed, the focus is usually on Americans held by the Japanese, not the reverse. Yet this history matters for understanding the full human cost of the war. These men's experiences reveal what happens when militarism takes hold of a society so completely that death becomes preferable to defeat. They show the possibilities of reconciliation, American guards, and Japanese prisoners who learned to see each other's humanity. They demonstrate the complex ways individuals navigate between conflicting cultural values when forced to choose. What truly stunned Americans about these Japanese POWs wasn't just that some chose to stay. It was the revelation of a completely different cultural framework. Surrender, which Americans saw as a practical response to overwhelming force, was for Japanese soldiers a form of social death. Capture, which Americans viewed as unfortunate but not dishonorable, brought shame that could last generations. America, which Japanese propaganda had portrayed as savage and demonic, became for some prisoners a place of unexpected refuge and possibility. The American guards and officers who witnessed prisoners' terror at the prospect of going home couldn't fully comprehend it, because they couldn't imagine a society where family love was conditional on never surrendering, where community membership depended on dying rather than being captured, where individual survival was less important than abstract honor. These different value systems had shaped the entire war. They explained the kamikaze attacks, the refusal to surrender islands, the suicides rather than capture, and they continued shaping lives long after the fighting ended. Each man who faced the choice to return or stay made the decision he felt he could live with, given impossible circumstances. Those who returned weren't necessarily braver or more honorable. Those who stayed weren't necessarily weak or traitorous. They were all casualties of a conflict that had shattered their lives and identities in ways that couldn't be repaired by simply going back to a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Their legacy is part of the larger story of World War II's aftermath. The painful, complex, sometimes surprisingly hopeful work of peace. Some helped rebuild Japan into a democratic, prosperous nation. Others helped build lives in America that would provide opportunities for their children. All carried burdens that shaped the rest of their lives, burdens that speak to the profound human costs of total war and the resilient, painful, complicated work of surviving it.